Well, the Devil May Cry Netflix series is just around the corner, and me being the big DMC fan that I am, I figured what better time to go back and watch the original Devil May Cry animated series from 2007, as despite the fact that I'm such a big fan of the series, I've never watched it before. Mainly because I was constantly told how bad and boring it was, so it was always pretty low down on my priority list. Although, if Advent Children has taught me anything, it's that people have terrible tastes, and I could have been missing out all of these years, so with that all being said, let's take a look at the original Devil May Cry anime. So, the short version, unsurprisingly, is that the Madhouse DMC anime is not particularly amazing. Though, I do think that there is some good stuff sandwiched in between the less than stellar stuff. And as long as you go in with the right expectations, I think you'll be able to walk away saying that you enjoyed it. For starters, I think something to remember is that the anime is not an adaptation, but its own original story that takes place after DMC 1 and 3, but before 2, 4, and 5, so takes place during a pretty quiet and mundane part of Dante's life. This is a bit of a double-edged sword, as it's kind of the core reason as to why many people find the show quote-unquote boring. But it also means that the show can play around with a lot of different stories that would otherwise be really hard to work into a game. For the most part, the anime revolves around small, one-off, Monster of the Week style episodes, with Dante taking on various odd jobs against relatively minor demons to keep the lights on in between his grander adventures. And while there is a general overarching plot, it's only really present for the first and last 2 episodes. Now, I would have preferred just a constant story for all 12 episodes of the show, but what I like about this and why I think it does work to at least some extent is that despite it not having the typical pacing and plot of a DMC game, it's able to play around with the setting and do some more interesting, different things that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And if the story was more substantial, I'd honestly be a little bit disappointed that such an important part of the franchise was delegated to just a side anime. Cross-media content struggles to get off the ground as is, and I really don't think Devil May Cry is the sort of series where you could get away with telling someone that the anime was a mandatory part of their play order. Granted, they could have just done an adaptation, but honestly, I think unless you took DMC 1 or 2 and really fleshed out those cutscenes, it would have felt a little bit pointless. Either way, what we got may be quite a bit different to the games, but I definitely still enjoyed it. It was honestly really nice to get some much more in-depth world building for the series. Like, if you think about it, I don't think we see a single normal human being in DMC until the citizens of Fortuna in 4. The town that Virgil summoned the Temenigru into was both completely empty, but also for some reason in the middle of the desert. We get to take a look at Dante's everyday life to see how he deals with ordinary people, and while it's completely unintentional, it is funny how the anime helped develop the Dante is depressed theory to explain how he goes from woohoo wacky pizza man in 3 to the much more suave collective version of himself in 1 to deadly silent and brooding in 2, and then finally back to the woohoo wacky pizza man in 4 and 5. And while the entire show is essentially just filler, there are actually quite a few different episodes that I thought stood out. Episode 3 has a couple who fall in love that mirror Dante's parents, with one being a demon and the other being a human. Episode 9 is basically a stand battle based around poker, which had a pretty fun twist that I only guessed half of, and episode 10 introduces the concept of demon swordsmen who were loyal to Sparta himself, giving us a glimpse of just how the demon world kind of operated. Admittedly, they're not all winners. The Prison Break episode's prison is strangely stocked with BDSM leather uniforms instead of Mad Max leather, and the demon that causes all of the problems in said episode is really dumb. The one episode that really stood out to me, however, is episode 8, Once Upon a Time. What makes this one particularly interesting is its implied connections to Dante's past, specifically when he went by the name Tony Redgrave, as this random guy suddenly shows up and starts calling Dante Anthony. Because Dante's fake alias has always been Tony, there's this sort of back and forth on whether or not the guy is genuinely mistaken or if Dante is just trying to hide his past in order to protect him. What's funny is this might be unintentional. See, as part of the plot, this guy who believes he knows Dante is trying to clear his quote-unquote mother's name, since the town that they grew up in all blame her for a demon attack that happened when they were kids. But this has several plot holes in it, as it would imply that Dante had changed his name before the demon attack that killed his mother, which doesn't make sense since he changed his name to avoid demons finding him after they killed her. So you'd think that this random dude would have to have been mistaken. But at the same time, there's stuff like Dante obviously knowing where their time capsule that they buried was, implying that he is the Anthony that this random guy happens to know. Now, there is a theory that I saw online saying that the picture of Anthony as a kid wearing a blue jacket is actually secretly Virgil, and the reason why the guy was mistaken is obviously because Dante is his identical twin. But personally, I think the explanation that makes the most sense is that after the attack that killed Dante and Virgil's mother, he changed his name to Anthony Redgrave, Tony for short, and still being this scared, relatively normal looking child was at some point taken in by some mystery woman who pretended to be Dante's mother to help him hide amongst humanity. Which would make sense as Dante rejects his demon side all the way up to halfway through DMC3. And this probably worked for a while, allowing Dante to settle down with this new human life, but at some point the demons would have sniffed him out again, resulting in this poor woman's death. And Dante at this point realizing that he'd have to keep moving and never settle down until he was strong enough, otherwise more and more people would just keep getting hurt. As I said before, the biggest strength of the series is its ability to build up the world of Devil May Cry and flesh out Dante in ways that the games are just not able to. And I don't think it shows better than in this episode, even if it's not necessarily intentional. And if that doesn't float your boat, there are also a few episodes with some nice fan service in there as well. For example, there's an entire episode built around Lady and Trish meeting each other for the first time and fighting each other. And speaking of which, I should probably talk about the rest of the cast since it's not all just Dante. Starting off with episode 1, we have our first newcomer, Patty, a little girl that Dante is tasked with protecting from demons who are sent after her by her uncles who want to cut her out from inheriting a huge family fortune. You might know her from her very small cameo on the phone in DMC5, but either way, Patty ends up sticking around for the entire show and is probably the second most present character, followed by Lady and Morrison, who are in joint third. A lot of people find her annoying, and if you're allergic to anime dubs, you're probably not going to either, but personally, I didn't mind her too much. As a character by herself, she's nothing particularly special, but her bossy, loud, precocious personality does bounce off of Dante's depressed but very openly immature demeanor very well. Morrison is another newcomer to the franchise, and one that you'll also know from DMC5, although his appearance in the anime was before he got his melanin trigger. Basically, he's an info broker who acts as a sort of agent for Dante, finding him jobs for a small cut of the profit. He essentially exists as a replacement for Enzo from the DMC1 novel and free manga, who would go on to spiritually appear in Bayonetta. Morrison as a character is pretty chill and cool, but there's also not really a lot going on with his character. He only really exists in the show to act as a plot device, as somebody to give Dante jobs without the actual person having to be there. So I can see why they mix things up a bit with his appearance and personality in DMC5. Lady, on the other hand, is pretty fun, with a constant running gag throughout the show of always dumping more and more debt onto Dante, since he keeps losing bets between them or causing so much damage on jobs that his entire paycheck ends up going towards repairs. And overall, she's very much in line with the same sort of dynamic that she had in the early cutscenes in DMC 4 and 5. One thing that I did think was a little bit strange though is she swears a lot throughout the show. Like, I'm hardly a prude, but I do always look back at that early interview for DMC1 mentioning that they wanted to make an action hero who doesn't need to smoke, drink, or curse to look cool. And while I don't think that needs to be a set-in-stone rule or anything, I do think that you want to avoid overdoing it lest we get another DMC situation. It's in no way anywhere near as bad as the reboot, but she does call Trish a bitch like 7 or 8 times in a single episode, and it just comes across as really catty, which is not what I'd see Lady as. Speaking of Trish though, she is the one character that, to be honest, I felt really disappointed by. I was kinda hoping we'd get some more screen time with her, since the majority of her story moments are in DMC1 that has some less than stellar writing and voice acting, and is honestly pretty light on story in general. But sadly, she's barely in the show. Outside of the Lady vs. Trish episode, she pretty much just disappears again until the final couple of episodes when the plot decides to reveal itself. Which really feels like some wasted potential to me, because outside of Lucia, Trish probably has the least actually going on with her character than anybody in the series, and is kinda just relegated to being sassy alongside Dante in some shape or form. The show even hints at something going on in the background, mentioning why the two of them are split up to fight demons separately for a bit, but we don't actually see them go into any of that stuff, and it all stays off screen. And you know what also stays off screen? Most of the action. See, as much as I'll try and sing the praises of the DMC anime and gas it up as much as I can, it does have one very fatal flaw that is undeniable. And that's that it just does not have the budget to be as flashy as you'd want a DMC anime to be. Now, by 2007, digital animated anime had really started to pick up some steam, so sadly I can't use this as an excuse to wave my banner of traditional vintage cell animation being better, but I do think that at the time, especially with a low budget, a lot of concessions had to be made. Madhouse were, and still are, an excellent animation studio, especially in this era, responsible for animes such as Death Note, Claymore, and Supernatural the animated series. But it's very clear that the Devil May Cry anime just could not get the same love. And the studio would have to either sacrifice the detail of the art itself or the quality of the animation. And the result we got is just a ton of fight scenes that are filled with really close-ups, sudden cutaways, and Dante just opting to put most demons down with his guns. In all fairness though, there are a couple of times where they do cover up the fact that they don't have a budget in some really cool and interesting ways, like in episode 1 where Dante tells Patty that, "Sorry, this show ain't for kids," and then proceeds to shoot down the stage curtain to cover up all of the action as blood leaks out from underneath it. It's honestly a pretty raw image when you pair it with the silhouettes of Dante and demons having at each other, but unfortunately, pretty much every episode does something like this to reduce the need to actually animate anything, and it does it in less and less interesting ways each time. And the more they end up doing it, the less you can argue that it's just cool artistic direction instead. I mean, you'd expect that the final episode with this big, powerful super boss demon would have some really cool action scenes where Dante has to go all out, and it technically gets that, seeing Dante activate his devil trigger and everything, but when I say activate, I mean activate and not actively use, as the fight starts with him glowing red before the screen just fades to white. And then the fight is over. They couldn't even afford a big finale. Pretty much every single fight struggles to last even a minute long, and it's just not what you'd want from an anime based on a popular character action game like Devil May Cry.
This episode's showdown took a mere 76 seconds. Whee!
Though, to be fair, considering Dante's quote-unquote canon power level at this point and general strength of the demons he faces, it does make sense that he could be one-shotting all of them the entire time. But that argument does kind of fall into a similar territory of, we made it bad on purpose, like, okay, I get it, it makes sense, but it does kind of spoil the final result. But yeah, overall, despite some very obvious shortcomings, I think the animated series is pretty good despite not necessarily being what your average fan would want. If you've ever felt like the games leave things off without giving too much closure, or you just want to see more of the DMC world, then you'll probably have a pretty good time. With only 12 episodes, it's pretty short and sweet like a strawberry sundae, and it's certainly got the vibes right, and has a ton of little nods to the rest of the series that I enjoyed, like how each episode is referred to as a mission like the levels in the games. So I definitely do recommend it, especially if you're a DMC fan, but don't go into it expecting it to blow you away or anything, because it just isn't going to. Now, I was going to have a section where I talked about the various novels and mangas that have come out for DMC over the years, because I have actually read a few of them now in preparation for this video. Partly because, as with the anime, I'd never experienced them before, so I wanted to give them a go. But also because I felt like the upcoming Netflix anime was going to borrow and take a bunch of things from those novels and such, and they definitely have in some ways, but it's becoming more and more clear that as we get closer to the actual release, it's just gonna be its own thing that takes a couple of elements here and there and nothing else. I'm still cautiously optimistic for it. I mean, I'll still enjoy it regardless, but it's definitely not going to be what I thought it was going to be either. This next section where I would have talked about the novels and stuff was also nearly as long as the anime section itself, and this video was just meant to be a quick little one I put out between my main ones, so I didn't really want to bog it down with extra details. So on that note, I figured I'd just wrap things up here. The next upcoming video on the channel is likely going to be the longest one I've made yet, so I'd rather put in the extra effort making that as good as possible than kind of stretching out this one. So yeah, with that in mind, have a nice day.